Ever feel like the economy is running on some secret code? Like there's this hidden rule book explaining why things cost what they do, or, why some countries seem richer than others?
Yeah, that's a pretty common feeling. And honestly, you're not totally wrong.
Okay, good. So today on the deep dive, we're trying to pull back that curtain. We're looking at those really basic economic ideas, the bedrock stuff, right?
Exactly. We've gone through a lot of material on, well, why countries trade, how we measure the economy's health, think GDP, and, what those numbers really mean for long-term growth.
Right. And our mission basically is to demystify these concepts, find the surprising bits, the stuff that actually connects to, your everyday life.
We want to cut through the jargon, the overwhelming charts, make it clear, make it hopefully interesting.
Okay, let's do it. Let's unpack this, starting with what seems simple. Why do nations trade? Why bother?
Well, okay, the core idea here is something called comparative advantage. Now, first instinct might be it's just about who's flat out best at making something. That's absolute advantage.
Like Saudi Arabia and oil, or Brazil with coffee, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Saudi Arabia has the oil, Brazil the coffee beans, Canada loads of timber. That's absolute advantage, often down to resources or geography.
Makes sense. But you stress comparative advantage. What's the difference?
Comparative advantage is all about opportunity cost. What do you give up to produce something?
Give up.
Yeah. Think of like a top lawyer who's also a super fast typist. They have an absolute advantage in both law and typing compared to their assistant, right?
Sure.
But every hour the lawyer spends typing is an hour they could have been billing clients for, say, hundreds of dollars.
Yeah.
The assistant, their opportunity cost for typing is much lower. Maybe they'd just be filing papers otherwise, typing at their comparative advantage.
Ah, okay. So even if you can do everything, it makes more sense to focus on what you do most efficiently compared to other things you could be doing.
Yeah.
And trade for the rest.
Precisely. It's not about being the best overall. It's about the lowest opportunity cost, the relative trade-off. Yeah.
That's a neat twist. So what are the real benefits of countries doing this, specializing and trading?
Okay, imagine a country trying to do everything itself. Autarky, economists call it. What they can make and consume is stuck within their own limits, their production possibility frontier.
Right. They can only use what they have.
But when they specialize based on comparative advantage in trade, suddenly they can consume more than they could ever produce on their own. Their consumption possibility frontier expands way out.
So more choice, better prices maybe.
Often, yes. More choices, often lower prices, and generally a higher standard of living. It's like opening up a global supermarket instead of just your corner store.
Okay, trade makes the pie bigger. Got it. Let's switch gears a bit. Government's role in the economy. Always a hot topic. What's the baseline? What do governments always do, regardless of the system?
Well, this is interesting. No matter the economic system, market, command, whatever, government always plays a role. The absolute minimum is setting up and enforcing property rights. You need a legal system.
Why is that so fundamental?
Because without clear rules on who owns what and a way to make sure those rules stick, you can't really have contracts or investment or just reliable trade. It's the basic plumbing.
So even in a totally free market idea, you need that referee.
Absolutely. Now, how much more the government does, that varies hugely. In a pure market or laissez-faire system, the idea is minimal involvement. Just property rights, contract enforcement, maybe defense.
Then the opposite end of that spectrum.
That's your command economy, or centrally planned. There, the government basically makes all the big economic calls. What gets produced, how much, the price, who gets it, almost everything.
Okay. And then there's the middle ground, the mixed economy, which feels more familiar probably.
Right, and that's most modern economies, really. A mix. You have private businesses, supply and demand driving things, but the government also steps in quite a bit.
How so?
Well, regulating markets, providing safety nets. The sources mention things like subsidies for college, universal health care in some places, unemployment benefits. Those are big government roles in a mixed system.
Okay, that clarifies the different levels of involvement. Now, how do we measure all this activity? We hear GDP constantly. What is it actually telling us?
GDP. Gross domestic product. Yeah, it's the main yardstick for a country's economic output. It's the total market value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders in a specific time period, usually a year.
Finals and services.
Yes, crucial distinction. We want to avoid double counting. So if a company makes steel, and then a car company uses that steel to make a car, we only count the value of the final car in GDP, not the steel separately.
Because the steel's value is already included in the car's price.
Exactly. One way to calculate GDP is the value-added method, where you sum up the value added at each stage of production.
Okay, and the other main way, the one we see in headlines.
That's the expenditure method. It's an equation, GDP plus I plus G plus NX.
Right, C plus I plus G plus NX. Let's break that down. C is...
C is consumption, basically household spending on everything. Groceries, rent, movie tickets, haircuts, you name it. It's usually the biggest chunk of GDP. I is investment. Now, this has a specific economic meaning. It's not buying stocks generally. It's spending by businesses on new capital goods, factories, machines, office buildings. Also, changes in inventories count.
Inventories, like unsold stuff.
Yes. If a company produces something but doesn't sell it in that period, it's counted as inventory investment.
Oh.
Also, crucially, spending on new houses, residential construction falls under investment, and even the initial sale of stocks, IPOs, or new bonds, because that money is intended for business investment.
Wait, so me buying, say, Apple stock on the market doesn't count in GDP's investment?
Correct. In GDP terms, that's just a transfer of ownership of an existing asset. It doesn't represent new production. The company using money from an IPO to build a new factory is investment. Also, selling off old inventory from last year reduces the I component in the current year's GDP.
Interesting distinction. Okay, G.
G is government purchases. Spending by all levels of government, federal, state, local, on actual goods and services. Building roads, paying teacher salaries, buying military jets, that stuff.
What's not included in G?
This is important. Transfer payments are not included. Things like Social Security checks or unemployment benefits. Because the government isn't buying a good or service directly, it's just transferring income to individuals.
Okay. And the last one, NX.
NX is net exports. Simple idea. Exports minus imports. The value of stuff we sell to other countries minus the value of stuff we buy from them. If exports are bigger, NX adds to GDP. If imports are bigger, it subtracts.
C plus I plus G plus NX. Got it. That gives a clear structure. Now, our sources mentioned tariffs. How do those fit in, and who gets hit hardest?
Right, tariffs. They're taxes on imported goods. The idea is often to protect domestic industries, but the sources point out that, well, the cost often falls heaviest on lower-income families.
Why them specifically?
Because they tend to spend a larger share of their income on basic goods, and tariffs can push up the prices of exactly those kinds of imported items.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Things like fruits and vegetables, especially out of season. Clothing, lots of which is made overseas. Electronics, phones, laptops. Even parts for cars. Tariffs can make all those more expensive.
Yeah, that definitely hits home. Okay, another concept people mix up. Nominal versus real GDP. What's the deal there?
Oh, absolutely crucial difference for understanding growth. Nominal GDP uses current year prices to value the output of that year. Real GDP uses prices from a fixed base year.
Why use base year prices?
To adjust for inflation. If nominal GDP goes up, it could just be because prices rose, not because we actually produced more stuff. Real GDP takes the price changes out so you can see the change in the actual quantity or volume of goods and services produced.
So it gives a truer picture of growth.
Exactly. Calculating nominal is easy. Current quantity times current price. For real GDP, it's current quantity times base year price.
And the growth rate we always hear about, that's based on real GDP.
Usually, yes. To get the economic growth rate, you look at the percentage change in real GDP from one period to the next. So, real GDP later year, real GDP earlier year, real GDP earlier year times 100.
Can nominal GDP be lower than real GDP or higher?
Yep, all possible.
Yeah.
If prices have generally gone up since the base year, inflation, nominal GDP will be higher than real GDP.
Yeah.
Prices have fallen, deflation, nominal could be lower. If the current year is the base year, they'll be exactly the same.
Okay. Now, GDP gets used like it's the ultimate scorecard for a country, but the sources mention some limits, right? Especially for well-being.
That's a really important point.
Yeah.
Historically, yeah, for very poor countries, a rising GDP often does mean big improvements, better nutrition, healthcare basics. But once countries get richer, that link gets weaker.
Meaning more GDP doesn't automatically equal more happiness or a better society.
Pretty much. GDP doesn't capture everything we care about. It doesn't account for pollution or inequality or leisure time or unpaid work at home. Just producing more stuff isn't the whole picture of well-being.
So if GDP isn't perfect, what else should we look at? Are there alternatives?
There are. Our sources mention a few. One is the Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI. It tries to adjust GDP by subtracting the bads, like environmental damage and crime costs, and adding the goods GDP misses, like volunteer work.
Okay, that sounds more holistic. What else?
The UN's Human Development Index, HDI, that looks beyond just income. It includes measures of health, life expectancy, and education years of schooling, along with income per person.
Health, education, income. Makes sense. Any others?
There's also things like the Life Evaluation Index, LEI, which actually asks people how satisfied they are with their lives overall, trying to measure well-being more directly.
Interesting. These definitely give a broader view than just output. Okay, let's tackle another big one. Inflation. What is it, fundamentally?
Inflation basically is just the rate at which the general price level is rising. So
Yeah.
things are getting more expensive over time.
And the main problem with that is?
It erodes your purchasing power. Each dollar or pound or euro you have buys less stuff than it used to. The value of your money goes down.
How do we measure that rise in prices? I hear different numbers, like the GDP deflator.
Right. The GDP deflator is one way. We mentioned it indirectly. It's calculated as nominal GDP, real GDP, 100. The percentage change in the deflator tells you the inflation rate across the whole economy's output.
But the one we hear about most often is CPI, right? Consumer Price Index?
Yes. CPI is probably the most common measure for tracking the cost of living for typical households. It tracks the price changes of a specific basket of goods and services that urban consumers typically buy.
Basket of goods, like what?
Food, housing, transportation, clothes, medical care, entertainment, a whole representative mix. And sometimes you hear about core CPI.
Yeah. Well,
Core CPI just takes out the volatile food and energy prices from the main CPI basket. The idea is to get a better sense of the underlying, more persistent inflation trend without the big swings you can get in oil or food prices.
Okay. How is the CPI number actually calculated?
You figure out the total cost of that fixed basket of goods in the current year, divided by the cost of the exact same basket in the chosen base year, and then multiply by 100.
And the inflation rate using CPI is just the percentage change in that index number from year to year.
Exactly. CPI new year, CPI old year, CPI old year 100.
What do we use CPI for, practically speaking?
Two main things, deflating and indexing. Deflating means using CPI to adjust nominal values like wages or sales figures from the past into real terms so you can compare purchasing power across time.
And indexing.
Indexing is automatically adjusting payments or values to keep pace with inflation. Think cost of living adjustments, COLAs for Social Security, or maybe clauses in union contracts. Tax brackets are often indexed too.
Seems useful, but are there problems with CPI? Limitations?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's not perfect. One big one is substitution bias. CPI uses a fixed basket, but in reality, if the price of, say, apples skyrockets, people might buy more oranges instead. CPI doesn't fully capture that switch to cheaper alternatives, so it can overstate inflation.
Okay, what else?
It struggles to account for new products entering the market. How do you compare the cost of living now with smartphones versus 30 years ago without them? Also, quality improvements, your new laptop might cost the same as your old one, but be way better. CPI has trouble measuring that perfectly.
So it might make inflation look higher than it really feels sometimes.
Some economists argue that, yeah, due to those biases, it might overestimate true inflation slightly. Plus, its coverage isn't universal. It focuses on urban consumers, potentially missing rural experiences. And, of course, your personal spending might look very different from the average basket.
You mentioned another measure earlier, PCE, personal consumption expenditures. Why does the Fed prefer that one?
Right. The Fed, the U.S. central bank, often looks more closely at the PCE price index. Two main reasons our sources give. One, its formula does account for people substituting goods as prices change, unlike the basic CPI.
So it adapts to changing buying habits.
Kind of, yeah. And second, the PCE data gets revised more often as more information comes in, so it might be a bit more up to date.
Interesting. Now, thinking about different people's experiences, do prices change differently in rural versus urban areas for certain things?
Yes, the sources highlighted a few areas where that gap can be significant. Running a car, for instance. Often higher costs in rural areas due to longer distances, less public transport.
Makes sense.
Also, the cost of groceries, not just the food itself, but maybe having to travel further to get to a big supermarket. And access to health care, especially specialized care or elder care, can be much costlier or harder to find outside cities.
Really shows inflation isn't just one number. It hits different people differently. What about shrinkflation? I keep hearing that term.
Shrinkflation. It's
Okay.
a bit sneaky. That's when the price of a product stays the same, or maybe goes up just a little, but the amount you get is reduced. Smaller chocolate bar, fewer chips in the bag.
So you're paying the same or more for less.
Exactly. It's a form of hidden inflation because the price tag itself might not look alarming, but your purchasing power is still going down.
Very tricky. Okay, let's pivot to unemployment. There's this thing called Okun's Law. What's that about?
Okun's law is like a rule of thumb based on historical data connecting changes in GDP to changes in the unemployment rate. Roughly, it suggests that for GDP to grow about 2 or 3% faster than its long-term trend, the unemployment rate tends to fall by about 1%, and the reverse if GDP slows down.
Does it always work like that? Is it a fixed law?
Not really a strict law, no. It's more of an observed tendency, and it doesn't always hold, especially lately. We've seen periods of jobless recovery.
Jobless recovery.
Yeah, where the economy, real GDP, starts growing again after a recession, but unemployment stays high or comes down really, really slowly.
Why does that happen?
Could be several reasons. Businesses might be hesitant to hire back workers until they're really sure the recovery is solid, or maybe technology adopted during the downturn allows them to produce more with fewer people.
Okay, so how do we officially count someone as unemployed? What are the definitions?
First, you have the labor force. That's everyone who is either employed or unemployed, but actively looking for work.
Actively looking.
Yes. Typically means you search for a job in the last 4 weeks and are available to start work. The unemployment rate is then simply the number of unemployed people divided by the total labor force, expressed as a percentage.
Got it. The sources mentioned some recent federal job cuts. Who's most affected when that happens?
Often, it's people in roles very specific to government work. Think certain types of scientists on federal projects, lawyers in specific agency roles, maybe veterans in particular programs. Their skills might not transfer easily to the private sector immediately.
Right. And there are different unemployment rates, aren't there? Like U3 versus U6.
Yes. The official rate usually you're quoting is U3. That's the standard definition we just discussed. People without jobs actively looking.
And U6.
U6 is a broader measure. It includes everyone in U3, plus people who are marginally attached to the labor force they want a job, looked recently, but aren't actively searching right now. And it also includes people working part-time who really want full-time work but can't find it. They're technically employed, but underemployed.
So U6 gives a wider picture of labor market slack.
Exactly. The sources gave an example for April 2025, U3 at 4.2%, but U6 at 7.8%. That gap shows there are quite a few people beyond the officially unemployed who are still facing challenges in the job market.
That's a significant difference. Okay, let's talk about types of unemployment. Frictional and structural.
Right. Frictional unemployment is kind of the normal, unavoidable churn in the labor market. It's the time it takes for workers to find the best job match.
Like people between jobs. Or recent grads looking.
Exactly. New people entering, people quitting to find something better, relocating, even just the time it takes for interviews and hiring processes. It happens because information isn't perfect. Searching takes time and effort. Some level of frictional unemployment is actually a sign of a dynamic, healthy economy where people can move to better opportunities.
Okay, so frictional is temporary, part of the process. What about structural?
Structural unemployment is more serious, more long-term. It happens when there's a fundamental mismatch between the skills workers have and the skills employers need. Or sometimes, just not enough jobs available in a particular region or industry for the number of people seeking them.
What causes that mismatch?
Lots of things. Big technological shifts making old skills obsolete, changes in consumer demand or international trade wiping out certain industries. Maybe the education system isn't keeping up. Generous, long-lasting unemployment benefits could potentially play a role by reducing the incentive to take available jobs quickly. Outsourcing is another factor, and sticky wages.
You mentioned outsourcing and jobless recovery earlier. Is outsourcing the main reason for those slow job recoveries?
It can definitely be a factor, shifting jobs elsewhere. But it's usually not the only reason. As we said, technology replacing workers is huge, and just plain caution from employers after a big shock, they wait to hire till they feel very confident.
And sticky wages, you mentioned that for structural unemployment too. Why don't wages just fall when lots of people are looking for work?
Yes, sticky wages means wages resist falling even when logic says they should. Why? Well, minimum wage laws set a floor. Labor unions negotiate contracts that lock in wages. There's also something called efficiency wage theory. The idea that paying workers above the minimum needed might actually boost productivity and morale and reduce costly turnover so employers choose not to cut pay. All these things make wages less flexible downwards than upwards.
Okay, So if you add frictional and structural unemployment together, what do you get?
That sum is basically the natural rate of unemployment, or sometimes called long-term unemployment. It's the unemployment rate that exists even when the economy is considered to be at full employment, meaning there's no cyclical unemployment caused by recessions.
So full employment doesn't mean zero unemployment.
Correct. It means unemployment is down to just the frictional and structural components. Cyclical unemployment is zero.
Got it. Let's zoom out again. Long-run economic growth, how is that defined?
Usually it's defined as a sustained increase in real GDP per person over time. Not just total GDP, but GDP divided by the population. That gives a better sense of average living standards rising.
And how is that different from an economic recovery?
A recovery is the bounce-back phase after a recession, getting back to the previous peak level of output. Growth is the ongoing increase in the economy's potential output, pushing that peak higher over the long term. Think of recovery as climbing out of a hole, and growth as building the hill taller.
Okay. What happened in the U.S. after that big recession in the early 80s during the Reagan years?
Well, the U.S. saw a long period of pretty strong economic growth after that. Unemployment came down significantly, inflation also fell, average incomes and wealth grew. But it's also noted that federal deficits got bigger during that time.
Right. The sources mention different historical views on growth: classical, Malthusian, neoclassical. Quickly, what were their main ideas?
Sure. Classical view, think Adam Smith. Big focus on labor productivity. Specialization, division of labor that makes workers more efficient, pushes out the production possibility frontier. Growth comes from getting better at making things. But they also saw potential limits, like running out of resources.
And Malthus, he was more pessimistic.
Very much so.
Ah.
Thomas Malthus worried about population growth outstripping food production. He thought diminishing returns in farming meant we couldn't feed ever more people, leading to checks on population like famine or disease, keeping living standards low long term.
Grim. What about the neoclassical view?
Neoclassical economists really zeroed in on capital accumulation investment as key to growth, like the Robinson Crusoe story. He catches more fish if he takes time off fishing to build a net first. Investing in tools, equipment, factories, capital makes labor more productive.
And again, just to clarify, buying stocks isn't investment in this sense.
Not usually, no. Buying existing stocks is mostly saving, shifting ownership. Investment in the GDP and growth sense is creating new capital, the factory, the machine, the software. The exceptions are IPOs and new bond issues, where the money raised is used for that kind of real investment.
Okay, so how does saving fit into this picture of investment and growth?
Saving is basically the source of funds for investment. For businesses to invest in new machines or buildings, someone has to save money first. Those savings flow through banks or financial markets to become the loans or equity that fund the investment.
So more saving could lead to more investment and potentially more growth.
Generally, yes. If people or businesses decide to save more, that increases the pool of loanable funds, which can lower interest rates and make it cheaper for firms to borrow and invest in productive capacity. That boosts long-run growth potential. Changes in saving behavior definitely matter.
Makes sense. Now, the Asian tigers and the catch-up effect, what are those?
The Asian tigers refers to South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan economies that saw incredibly rapid growth starting in the mid to late 20th century. The catch-up effect is the theory that poorer countries can actually grow faster than rich ones for a time,
Why?
because they can adopt technologies and business practices already developed by richer countries. They don't have to invent everything from scratch. They can import know-how and capital, allowing them to close the gap relatively quickly, at least initially.
Was the U.S. growth spurt in the 80s the same kind of catch-up?
No, not really. The U.S. was already a mature, developed economy. Its growth drivers were different things like deregulation, tax changes, recovery from recession. The Asian tigers were often starting from a much lower base, using different strategies, often state-guided and very export-focused, to rapidly industrialize. Economists like Krugman and Young studied whether their growth was more from just adding inputs, labor, capital, versus true efficiency gains.
Okay, different contexts. Lastly, the sources contrasted some African countries. Why have some places rich in resources seen little growth, while others with fewer resources have done better?
Yeah, it's a stark contrast sometimes. The evidence points strongly toward the quality of government and institutions. Countries with abundant resources but plagued by corruption often see that wealth siphoned off or mismanaged. It discourages investment, creates instability. That's the resource curse idea.
So resources aren't enough.
Not at all. Conversely, some African countries without major natural resources have achieved strong growth. How? By having relatively stable, less corrupt governments, investing in education and health, building infrastructure, fostering business, adopting technology. Good governance seems much more critical than just having oil or diamonds.
That's a powerful point. Wow, we've covered a huge amount of ground. This has been super insightful. If we had to boil it down, what are the key connections you hope listeners take away?
I think the main thing is seeing how these concepts trade, GDP, inflation, unemployment, growth, are all interconnected. They aren't just abstract numbers. They reflect real forces shaping policy debates, business decisions, and ultimately our own economic lives and well-being. Understanding them gives you a better toolkit for navigating the world.
Absolutely. It gives you that lens, right? To understand the news, to think critically about economic policies. Okay, so here's a final thought to leave everyone with. We talked about GDP's limits. If you had to pick just one indicator besides GDP that best reflects a society's real progress, what would you choose and why? Something to chew on.
Definitely. And while you're thinking about that, maybe consider how these economic ideas we talked about today play out in your own financial situation, your community, and how you see the world working.